what I wanted to spend some time on this morning is, as Jeremy introed, taking a look at how brands like Huawei have overcome challenges in digital media, have identified opportunities, and then, at the end, I'll tackle very briefly the thorny issue of measurement in digital. I wanted to start, and no presentation in digital would be complete without it. Of course, the MarTech landscape, you can just about make it out. It's there, whitewashed in the background, quite deliberately. I think we see a lot of the same thing again and again in presentations, and so hopefully some of the perspective that I bring will be quite practical, quite operational. I originally trained as a computer scientist, and I started my career in digital in operations. So I've got that in the background of what I do all the time, but I don't think it should always be at the forefront of what we do. And let's see if that comes through. So I like to start with the actual behaviors that consumers are experiencing and the changes that they're undergoing, rather than starting with that technology framework, because I think that's where the focus should be in our industry, and that is actually the true starting point. So we saw on Sarah's summary a moment ago from Nielsen, we saw the same thing that someone like Mary Meeker would put in her slides. For example, that time spent on mobile is ever increasing, and yet as a channel for the last 5 years or longer, it's been massively underinvested. So the list of consumer change and trends, it goes on and on. I think we can summarize a lot of these changes by two really big transformative forces that are happening. First of which is the fragmentation of media. So when we look at all those bar charts and we see all the various channels, we know that the splits, and even within channels, are only ever increasing. So it's becoming more granular. So that idea of buying a TV spot and then being able to reach the audience all at once, that's really hard to do these days. Equally, I think what belies the increasing time spent with media is that attention. We used to call it dual screening or tri screening. That problem is getting worse. Trying to capture an audience attention is becoming really, really hard. It has been hard for a number of years. Then there's data. And data utilization. So data is making it possible for us to engage and personalize more effectively than ever before. So these I still think are the big trends belying the Nielsen data that we saw earlier, that are in the background of Mary Meeker's intro to internet trends. So as an industry, we've become quantiphiliacs. We love measurement. I think and my position on this will become clear as I go through this. I think it's a double-edged sword, because the internet, for example, it's often framed, and we saw this in Will's presentation earlier. Often the starting point for internet is as an e-com channel, as a direct response medium. I feel that's too narrow. I think the internet's been pigeonholed into that. We didn't see as much success with online in brand building over the last decade. Brand building and selling for brand is much harder to do than selling for response, selling for e-com. So I think also that's fueled into some of the metrics that we favor. So it's skewed our perception of where we should focus on our data. And we saw from the previous presentation, if your business is geared towards e-commerce or selling, then of course you may naturally privilege the data, but we're losing sight of brand building and the value that we can get from that. And I think that's really important. So one of the things I wanted to address is, obviously, how did we land up in this mess? And let's start unpacking some of the data points that have led to this proliferation of data. So, ad side tracking. There's a deluge of data that comes from ad side. Then there's on-site tracking, so your web analytics, your profiling, your customer view, social, CRM, that's been around probably, from an email marketing perspective, one of the earliest and most developed areas. Then more recently, we've got social listening tools. And then, of course, your media management platforms like DMPs. Some of them producing data, some of them utilizing data, but effectively, it's data upon data upon data. And not all of it is useful for our businesses. And that's the key point I want to message home. And so this is also being driven commercially by high valuations in MarTech and AdTech. So when we take a look at your Lumascapes, your MarTech landscapes, those are all businesses and startup organizations and or quite developed businesses that have received often funding from VCs and or are listed companies that have often a high valuation, and that has a knock-on effect that once on the client side, on the brand side, once we've procured these tools, we need to show value for that investment. And I think if you're sold something that has been priced too highly, you're also going to value it too highly. So I think, and there's a real danger in that's led to an overvaluation of certain metrics and certain quadrants, if you like, or certain areas of that MarTech landscape and all the various Lumascapes. So I think we risk losing sight of solving for technology problems and not necessarily the customer or audience behaviors. And that's a key difference in terms of how brands like Huawei are looking at technology investment and are looking at the various ways in which you can make decisions around media investment in this digital world. So also, I think that as an industry, there are things that we speak about quite a lot, and then they're the more kind of silent issues. So the things we speak a lot about, programmatic, you really can't escape it. There's dedicated blogs, dedicated news channels, and it's huge. Do I think we should not speak about it? No, but I think we speak too much about it. Same thing for social media. Social media is huge. Probably say too much about it. Content marketing, slightly less so, but I'd say it's up there on the list. Search marketing, again, a dedicated channel in itself. And then probably the one that is probably the most borderline within that list that I've iterated is your brand versus direct response. You used to see that debate happening quite a lot. And that comes back to my opening gambit, which is, internet and digital marketing. We definitely favor that response side of things. And I put that alongside the e-com model, if you like, or framework. So those are things that we've spoken about in the industry or tend to speak about. So what are some of the things that we don't speak as much about? So where's our inventory coming from? How does that affect buying and or planning decisions? This is quite key. So there's a mobile versus desktop inventory decision and criteria that is often not really addressed, and the full extent of the opportunity is not fully mined there. How does that then knock on effect? How does that then knock on into creative? So do we as brands and do we as an industry fully leverage the extent of an OpenGL ad, for example, or creating ads in HTML5? I don't think that we do enough in this regard. We don't often enough create ads that are built for purpose. So mobile-specific ads. It's not good enough to run an IAB format ad on a mobile and assume that's going to be effective. It's not. Next thing that we probably don't speak enough about is what has been written about in the press, but it's definitely not been addressed to the full extent. This myth around paid, owned, and earned. I think, long gone are the days, and perhaps it never really was something that existed. Gone are the days of, you pay for your customers on social media, and that gives you a proxy or right to message them into infinity. That doesn't exist. Social media is a publishing channel. They are publishers. And one pays in order to message someone on a particular occasion, and one pays again after that. And it's something that I don't see has filtered through into the, if you like, the top level strategy. So if you're still hearing about paid, earned, and earned in that context, you've got to be asking yourself some questions whether that is truly the world we live in. Coupled with that, you've obviously got this issue of getting the right message to the right audience, and that's not necessarily the same thing as the right ad, the right moment, the right audience. It's something more around the content marketing, and it's something more around, if one's looking at targeting decision makers or one's targeting consumers, when are we getting that right message to them, and what is it that they want? So it's not necessarily one-to-one personalization, but it's something that is granular and built for a particular occasion. Then something that cropped into popularity, increasing popularity very recently with the YouTube issue, is brand safety. But I don't think this should be limited to video. So the debate right now in the industry is that, video and brand safety. But what about display? How many people have considered where the display ads are running and what long-form copy it's running against, for example? I think this is the elephant in the room, because if we look at video investment versus display investment, you can start to see how important that is for the larger display vendors in terms of inventory. So what are the three core biases that I personally favor in terms of that help me make decisions around investment and guide me in terms of decision making in terms of digital media? Well, one should definitely focus on one's core capabilities. So if your organization is focused on brand building and developing equity from that, and that's going to ultimately translate into greater value, greater pricing, greater margin, then and let's say that business is not as focused on e-commerce or selling directly online, then be careful about the solutions you're buying, the point solutions that are out there, and maybe start focusing more on brand. Develop smart partnerships. Again, whitewashed in the background is the MarTech landscape. One of the things that I'm incredibly cognizant of is, as much as it's possible, understand in the areas that are important to your organization, who's funding who, where do you think the players are moving, where do we think a certain vendor might be in 12 to 18 months? Because by the time you've onboarded or embedded in technology, and they get acquired by one of the big behemoths, or they delist, or whatever it might be, how's that going to affect the stack or technology environment that you're creating for your business? And that's really key. So understanding how to navigate this world in terms of the commercial partnerships is really key. And then build on unique strengths. It's not good enough to follow the herd and to purchase off-the-shelf solutions and put them together in ways that are often very similar to one's competitors. You're not going to result in anything that's going to deliver you great differentiation in terms of value. So you've got to start creating more unique strengths. So how one buys off the shelf and how one puts it together should be done with a bit of strategic insight also. And then, let's not forget, often, the end user is either a marketing team, or if you're lucky, you're hiring in data scientists, whoever they may be. But the end user is key. I've seen, even within the agency experience I've had, change is not easy. I liken it to, if you're a Windows user and you're told to use a Mac, generally people find it awkward. It's going to slow you down. It's going to make you less productive, and vice versa. If you're a Mac user and you put it into a Windows environment, you're going to find that kind of change difficult. You're going to find yourself slowed down. Imagine what it's like, when you're moving from one DMP to another, or a search management platform from one to the other. I've seen people that are incredibly skilled and expert in certain environments flounder as you do a tech vendor shift. So, workflow changes. One thing I continually underscore: they're not easy. So these are big decisions that are going to impact your business in terms of performance and operational excellence. So, they require a lot of thought. So I said I would cover, this thorny issue of measurement. So what is ROI in terms of digital investment? It's really easy, right? It's the value you get divided by the investment. That's a really simple definition of ROI. But I think in terms of the value that we're defining, it needs to be specific to organizations. And I return to the point, and I've hammered on it because it is so important. For certain brands, for example, brands coming out of out of mainland China as a particular example, international brand building may be more important than a direct response value-driven set of metrics. So one needs to say, well, what's important for my brand? And it's very specific. It's not something necessarily that the ecosystem will say, well, that's the value you should be getting from your digital investment. You should be counting your social media interactions or this or that, and they're going to have a knock-on effect into your lead gen program. That might not be as important as a brand-led engagement model for your brand. And it depends. It really depends. So that definition of how brands themselves and how marketers define value, I think, is absolutely crucial. And it's not something that necessarily a third party can tell the brand. The brand needs to figure that out for themselves. So one other thing I like to say is avoid easy ROI. So what is easy ROI? It's something that usually appears on a weekly or quarterly spreadsheet. It's too easy. Why is it, and what exactly is problematic with that? Well, often it doesn't take into account double counting, over attribution, these kind of things. As an industry, we haven't solved for attribution fully. We heard that on the previous panel. We sold the 7% number in terms of the hotel bookings. We over attribute what we do in digital often. And often, channel by channel, people would be trying to claim sales that aren't necessarily driven by them. And it's very hard. We haven't solved for that as an industry. Econometrics doesn't solve for it. An attribution piece of technology doesn't solve for it. So back to this question of ROI, it's not as easy as it first seems. If you take the MarTech landscape, if you take the various Lumascapes, and if you were to procure in the various boxes a piece of technology and stitch it together, and if you were to take the sales pitches from those various organizations and/or vendors and add them up, you will come to a number greater than 100, in terms of a percentage. So in itself, it's hyped up. And I think as a brand, in order to navigate this, one needs to see through this. So I guess for ROI, and looking at it more sensibly, is to take a longer-term view of this. And that's where brand starts to play into it more than anything. Because if we do, and I do think there's some credence in it, if we think that the internet is ultimately going to be a seamless surface of shopping, which I think that is it is one vision that's emerging, it's one experience that's emerging, I think it is already emerging. We shouldn't lose sight, should we all be on the race to the bottom? Should we just accept this? I don't think so. I think increasingly that then pushes us to think that building brands where you could sustain a higher level of pricing because of brand value, I think it's never been more important. It's never been more important. So that's what I mean by taking a longer-term view of ROI. The short-term view in terms of calculating sales, that's very easy. But then you're pitting yourselves against the Amazons of the world and the big e-com retailers of the world, where if you want to settle for a price-driven environment, that's what you're going to get. I think we'd be selling ourselves too short, and I think we'd be limiting ourselves to a future where we, as an industry, have become quantumaniacs. The belief that everything can be solved by measurement and algorithms alone. So you can hashtag that if you want. I think that is, that's probably the number one thing that keeps me focused on what is the right thing to do in the industry. Is that, if if one can simply press a button and say that is the measure of my performance, that's the dashboard for digital, that's how we're doing, then there's probably something wrong. It's not that simple. It can't be that simple. Because brand value and response, the two have never really stacked up. And as an industry, we haven't really addressed that gap, and we haven't really looked into that enough for online and digital specifically. So I've kept it quite short. We're running over time. So I've allowed plenty of time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.